Hello fellow engineers and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abuck Nasty. In today's video we're going to be talking about automation science. Now when I'm saying that, what I actually mean is we're talking about all the different ways that you can in the very late game make the most UPS optimized version of automation science. What I've asked is people in my Discord channel, I've asked them to join a competition to make all 6 sciences on Novice, and we've submitted all the different designs, and this is a series of me going through and testing all of them. So for automation science is the #1 most submitted one. We have 14 unique designs that we're going to be 14 unique authors that have submitted designs, and we have 16 unique designs that we're going to be covering today. Now, when we're talking about that, there's so many different ways to make 240 science per second, right? So what I mean by that, that's a fully stacked belt of a green belt. Now, what you're seeing in front of you is a monstrosity that I cooked up for this video just to demonstrate the sheer scale of what this actually is before you get into the very late game and in order to produce this science. So if you're stuck with low tech and you've got effectively assembly machines 2s, this is the sheer amount of just raw power that you would need in order to make 240 science per second. You would need 1,600 assembly machines, and you would need, well, actually in grand total here in order to do this. You're seeing the stats here on the side of the screen of just how many sheer just number of furnaces you're going to wind up needing, and let alone all the number of inserters and everything. So this works, right? This makes 240 science per second. However, this is a lot of inserters, and when we talk about UPS in the late game, we talk about can we use the most minimal amount of components? Because in the end game, before we get into any designs or anything like that, this is an example of the exact same amount of science using legendary machines, legendary productivity, right? This is making a fully stacked 240 science per second. Now, this is the most bare bones, basic benchmark like baseline that I've created for this test in this series, but there's several more designs that iterate from this, and the question is this the most UPS efficient here? Oh, I'm sorry for grabbing the giant monster that I just had there. So is this the most UPS efficient here? Probably not. So what is? Well, we know it's not this monster. So let's go and try to look at all the wonderful designs that have been submitted by people on my Discord. And in the end of the video, if you stick around to it, what we're going to do is we're going to go through an in-depth analysis on all of them. I've taken on the benchmarking of all the designs. And as we get further in the series, there's a few sciences that I've submitted myself in order to go and create benchmarks for them as well. So also, why are we doing this? Well, as you know, I am currently exploring using quality science on Novice in order to basically create the 4 million SPM base that you had seen, or ESPM, so effective science per minute. So the question that I have is actually Q2 or uncommon science better than producing common science? And the question that, in order to answer that, I've asked people in my Discord community to go and create the best designs that they can, because just because I can create a good design, that doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily the best from a UPS perspective. So I'm going to be hosting this UPS war. We're going to go through all 6 sciences, and that's going to be what I'm going to be covering. And in the very conclusion of this series is when I'm going to bring in Q1 science, so common, and put it head-to-head against Q2 or uncommon science. And I'm also going to be making a Q2 utility science so that we can benchmark against that. And hopefully, finally, after all these months, I'll be able to answer the big question that I have, which is the normal stuff here, is this as good as its uncommon counterpart or not? So with that, let's get into all the designs that have been submitted. So to start off the competition, I'm going to talk through all the wonderful designers and all the different designs that they've submitted. So first we have Jaden0303, Astroboy, Reja, Zephyr24, McMahon57, Camraid, Cubes, Jobo, Elcron, Flab, Geist, Tenebris, Zitron22, and The End. So they've all gone and submitted all the different designs that I've cataloged here. These are all on my GitHub channel. You can check out their blueprints and the save files here in the video description below, along with the report that is going to be here. I have compiled the report, but I'm not going to show that quite yet. We're going to go through, and I want to kind of, to make this a little more fun, we're going to talk through all the different designs that are here, but I'm not going to put a number next to them for the sake of not having, if you are a particular fan of the designer that has designed this, so that you don't have an implicit bias to that. But I want you, when we're approaching this video, take an intuitive thought about which of the different designs you think is going to be the best. And then I'll showcase which ones those are in order, and we can talk through that here at the end. Sound good? Great. So, moving on, let's go into the actual designs that are there. And for the simplicity's sake, just so that everyone knows, there's a design index. Instead of giving them a name for each individual name for the design, they're all very different, but also similar. I've kind of tagged what they effectively do, but at just a high level, whenever you're seeing a number in here, that's just a number. So this is design 0, that's the baseline, which I'll show first, and then all the other designs that are here. So with that, let's get into the actual designs. So first, I've created a baseline benchmark. This is what you would most commonly see in a Megabase without using any of some of the fancy techniques that I've talked about in previous videos. So if you're interested in some of that, definitely go check out lead follower clocking, some of the inserter optimizations you can do for UPS, basically my whole UPS optimizations playlist. Definitely good, just go and check some of those out if you're interested in them. This is the most basic case that I could come up with that still is using max beacons. So we're using 12 beacons around one of these assembly machine 3s here. And then also using max prod. So this is like your most typical case, all legendary, everything. This relies on a concept of wake list. Yellow means it's inserting and it's checking if it needs to do something. This is also real time, by the way. You can see how often it's doing it. And it's also just checking how often it needs to take something out of the machine. So that's that green check mark. One of the main things you're going to see is a very common design pattern is everyone's using some form of clocking. Most people are. And by clocking, that just means controlling the inserters on the circuit network instead of relying on wake lists, because the performance usually tends to be more optimal that way. So this setup's really simple. It effectively just makes 240 science per second and uses what would be a pretty standard quick copy paste. You just put everything down, no circuit shenanigans, and you're just using foundries and using a fluid bus. Now, most of the designs use a fluid bus. What is a fluid bus? It means just you pipe everything on effectively a bus like this. So everything is going to, and then just routing from that pipe to the individual machines that need to be creating the end products that you need. So usually that's going to be molten metals. So we have copper and iron here. Most of the designs do that. Some of them actually go and make them in-house. So some of them have an adapter, and we'll talk through those. But first, what I'm going to do is we're going to talk at a high level. We're going to go back down to all the rest of the sciences. So here's the baseline. We have a lot of different designs that are here. And I want to talk about some of the unique features. A lot of them are very similar. So you're going to see a lot of direct insertion builds. So a lot of builds that look effectively like this, where there are directly from a foundry, we're inserting directly into an assembly machine. And then that is going to be your direct insertion build. There's also a good number of builds that still use effectively to use less machines as the core concept here. Let's use less machines and let's have less quote unquote inserters overall, but let's, instead of directly inserting from one machine into another, let's just feed them over a belt. So that's another strategy that you're seeing here. All the time when you're seeing these red and green wires, that's pretty much almost most people in the design competitions using this concept of a lead follower, high level refresher. It monitors one machine and then just says, hey, we are less than a value. Go and send that value to these inserters to go and say, hey, go pick something up. Or vice versa. You have enough science in one of the machines, go and drop it. So that's what you're seeing most commonly used as in terms of the control strategy. There's also a secondary concept, and I want to first talk through this because this is one of the coolest things that kind of has come out of the competition. Kind of as a meme I posted on my Discord channel saying, hey, I've got something for chemical science, and I'm just pulling out something completely wild here, which was recipe switching. So this is actually Jobo's design. He wound up going really hard with this design and said, hey, I'm going to go and just try it for automation science. And let me just explain, this is actually really hard to do. This looks like, oh wow, this is working out great. But then as you start looking into the details, you start noticing, hey, this is a little weird. Why is it this combination of productivity in here? Like this is the legendary prod 3, legendary prod 2, and then just efficiency model. Why not all prod? Well, it overshoots when you're switching recipes, and you can't quite get, because the productivity becomes in play, and you don't quite get the timing right or inserting into the assembly machine. So this is actually the way that works, and this is just a discrete clock that is here. And it is just basically controlling for the first 23 ticks. It's going to say, hey, I'm going to use copper. And then the subsequent 27 to 41, it's going to be gears. And that is inserting in here. Now, this is really finicky to get this right. So this is definitely a proof of concept. All the rest of the designs, this is one exception that I made because I just thought this is so cool. Let's just go and try it and see how it works. But this is a concept that I think is pretty cool. And also just for DI builds, it's an interesting concept to be able to say, hey, let's still have, in this case, like 10 beacons around one of these assembly machines, but still have DI. So direct insertion usually is a trade-off between the amount of beacons you can get into something versus belting. Now with belting, right, you can always get 12, like you're seeing with this design here. However, once you get into direct insertion, like some of these builds over here, well, you're only going to get about 7 beacons around one of these assembly machines just due to the limitation of now they're being occupied by the machines that are inserting into them. So that's the trade-off that you normally take whenever you're designing something with direct insertion versus belting. So that's kind of a question too. So I'll pose this here as we're going through it. Do you think having more beacons around an assembly machine is going to make these perform better because you need less assembly machines to make the same amount of science? Or is the direct insertion build, like a lot of these that you see over here, going to work, but instead of having 12 beacons, having only 7? So that's another question. Anyway, so moving on. So we talked about recipe switching tech. This is an interesting one. We also have some builds that are using cargo wagon tech. This is a personal favorite of mine. I love this style. So this is still using lead follower, but one of the things I thought was interesting about this build is they said, hey, we're gonna use this as a giant chest. And the core concept here, as some of the DI builds are, okay, well, you can insert into a maximum of effectively 4 or 2, like depending on how many we're using. And so this is, again, a trade-off of let's use less furnaces, only enable them for a short period of time. We're going to go in the debug menu so we can see it. And you can see that, okay, it's just going to turn on for a brief moment, turn on a blip, have a filtered cargo wagon with all the different, basically the 2 different types of materials that are going to be in here. And actually what I thought was really unique about this build is it says, hey, let's monitor this. It's not only controlling the inserters on a lead follower concept, but it's actually doing it on the furnaces. The foundries. So the foundries themselves, what it winds up doing is it sends this X signal, which I thought was kind of cool. And it says, hey, whenever copper is greater than 32, just stop. So it's kind of like a, hey, you're not allowed to run. And so this goes to all of these. And you'll see even here, this is going to turn on and off saying, hey, don't run. So that's an interesting concept that I thought was pretty cool. This particular build suffered from something which was just, it accidentally had too many assemblers, which was known, but we just kept it in the competition as is. Why do I say it had too many? Because if you look at with rate calculator here, this is over 240 here. And so having these extra ones, they just unfortunately just never run. So that was just a downside to this particular design. In other words, you could remove this and it would be just fine. But for the sake of symmetry, I guess it was kept in, or it was a mistake. I don't remember exactly. Or in other words, we didn't discuss it. But the point is, this was kind of a cool concept that I might actually use for future stuff. I like that it actually starts and stops them specifically on a condition, so you don't have to have as much of a buffer built up for them to start and stop. So that is going to cover a lot of like the core concepts. However, there's one other build that I thought was just came completely out of left field. So there's a concept of an LDS shuffle. So what is that? So basically the concept is you can constantly produce copper and iron by feeding plastic directly into a foundry and cast low density structures. And one of the things that's interesting about this is whenever you actually go and create low density structures, you only very rarely ever have to send a signal to say, hey, go and make LDS. So, and it's just like a minimal amount of plastic for this build. One of the cool things that you can do is you can just see how much copper is in here. What happens with the recycler is whenever it dumps effectively copper plates inside here, it can do it in a quick spike where it just produces a whole bunch of copper and can just quickly fill this and then can be completely done with creating its copper effectively. So it kind of is like a step function. It's just when it needs it, the way that, and I'm not going to dive too far into the circuits here, but it's basically just monitoring when it needs to dump the iron and the plastic out of it whenever it stops up, and then otherwise it's just using it as a copper creator and in like a very quick instant spike. So it's Pretty cool concept. And then what it does is it then just takes all the extra materials, it feeds it all in here, and then uses the cheapest way to destroy steel, which is steel chest creation, and then destruction on a condition in the actual assembly machine and piping it back and forth. So the same thing with plastic, just having double-headed kissing recyclers to destroy it. This is probably the most wild build. No one else attempted this, and I'm so happy that this design was submitted, because it's such an interesting concept that I personally would have never done myself, and it's really cool to see this come to life. So that is effectively how this particular one works. It's actually pretty cool. I mean, it's all direct insertion, and I think the idea when I was talking to the designer of this was that, hey, we're gonna maybe reduce the amount of time that inserters are active and trade that just for occasionally a recycler turning on and dumping it into an assembly machine. So that's the concept here, and this makes 720 per second. I think that's correct if I did the math there, right? Yep, 720. So there was also, and you're seeing that across all these different designs that are here, all of them are using foundries. There was one design that I really am actually really appreciative that it was submitted, and that was a direct insertion build using furnaces. So a lot of the quality sciences are going to revolve around this concept of ore upcycling. So this is kind of a nice comparison in this particular video, because we are going to have a version that is using actually furnaces. Now, they used a really interesting control technique of reading belts and checking when it needs to actually output and throttle the inserters when they're actually putting things out. And I thought that was a really cool concept. The downside of this particular design was just the amount of combinators that they're using here. And so not using maybe a lead follower, which might have been a little bit more optimal for this particular design. But it's still, in principle, I thought it was really cool, the particular combinators that they're using, because they effectively here are adding the iron plates and the iron ore together, and then just setting a signal for iron plates, because effectively that's kind of the idea, is like how much actual iron is, quote, in this once it's done smelting. And so then it just monitors here and says, hey, whenever this is less than 32, go and insert something. And that was a really interesting way of like balancing that, of like balancing the inputs and outputs to always just make sure you have enough always in the actual particular furnace, and then just turning it on and off based on the circuit condition, which is all connected based on that. So I thought that was kind of a cool concept that I haven't actually explored myself, and actually works out really elegantly. So I wanted to kind of highlight that. They do the same thing here with throttling how often this assembly machine is going to be running by monitoring the contents of this belt and just topping it up occasionally when needed. So that's also, I thought, was a cool concept of how they're balancing the actual outputs. And so everything is DI except for the gears that are coming in here. And overall, this is actually a really nice, compact, and pretty unique design that I may actually incorporate some of these things into my quality science version. Now, what you're seeing here is a really common design pattern that is in all of them. We're going to get now a little bit more into the details now that I've shown kind of like the high level stuff. So almost all of these designs, except for one, is using this side loading technique. The reason for that is because this has been, it's not that this is more optimal for UPS, it's that it gets you around a lot of different problems that you wind up having. So by side loading it and using the fact that the undergrounds have a little space here, you can very easy, you don't have to interact with the same belt. And it also means that whenever there's a little gap, and you're seeing these little white gaps here, you don't have to time this inserter exactly perfectly to fill the gap whenever the other ones are running. So that's nice, because this acts as a tiny little buffer to make sure that these inserters can always dump and immediately be done, so that you're minimizing the time of the inserters actually being active. So you get not an explicit or a direct UPS benefit, you get an indirect UPS benefit. So you trade off a merge from a belt with the inserter itself being able to dump something onto a side-loaded belt, and then not having to make sure that the timing is exactly perfect on this particular belt, so that they are always interacting with an open slot in the belt itself. And you'll see that that's actually really hard to do, and there's one particular design that did actually do that. So I'm going to cover that in like more specifically, because I thought this was a really interesting concept. So this design here by the end actually wound up doing that, and you're going to notice here these little gaps here. these white lines represent a space in the belt. And you're seeing how exactly perfect this is. So the spacing matters here, the exact speed of these machines, and you're actually noticing something really interesting, that it's perfectly always inserting exactly when needed. But the downside, in order to do that, this is exactly 20 per second, not 20 point something, 20.1, 20.2. This is exactly 20 per second. And this was accomplished by adding a uncommon speed module 1 to exactly get the speed bonus on here to be effectively a whole number. So exactly getting 1500% on the speed bonus. I thought this was a really unique take because everyone else is using legendary everything. This is the only one that used mixed quality in the building materials. And also just pose the question, do you think that limiting, or having in this case more assembly machines, because these are only 20 per second, compared to a design like we've seen multiple times over here, where these are, 22.5, so a higher speed using all legendary, and having effectively here, if we look at this is 11 assembly machines compared to over here. And also I gotta appreciate the fact that this is 12 over here to make the same amount of science, right? Let me make sure that I'm talking correctly here. Yeah, so this uses basically one more assembly machine, but it is exactly perfectly at a ratio that will exactly make here, if we look at this exact speed here, 480 exactly per second. No fractions, no nothing. So the question then would be, do you think that this would be effectively better? I have my own intuition of what I think it would be. When I first looked at it, now, of course, I know the results, but when I first looked at it, I thought, okay, that's a really interesting concept, but I didn't think it would be a better approach because, and this is a little bit spoiler, it's a pretty good design. What I originally thought was this wasn't going to be so good other than the fact that it's direct insertion, because just you have one more assembler. So you're going to have it running a little bit more often, one more entity for the game to process, more inserters to process, more and interact with the belt, etc. And it wasn't using the technique that almost everyone else is using, that you're seeing pretty commonly here, is the side loading technique to kind of get around it. Now, it works because it's exactly 240 per second and is exactly filling the gaps every single time. So these inserters are active the same amount of time as this side. However, this is way more complicated to do, so hats off to the end for figuring this out. Okay, so that covers effectively the designs. Now, I want to go into a couple common pitfalls that happened as we started benchmarking these designs, and I started to notice them. So the first one that I kind of noticed was, and this was really revealed later when I started looking into the stats, was I saw kind of, like at least in this particular design, when you're first looking at this, you go, oh, okay, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong other than the fact that they're sending a lot of wires to all these individual inserters. So this makes sense. The core concept here was, let's go and have a signal, dedicated signal for copper. Let's have a dedicated signal for gears and copper, and then also for automation science itself. So, and they're basically using here, because of this is a concept of let's get as many beacons around these as possible and use the least amount of machines as possible, and still use side loading techniques and those things. But then because it's not as compact, somehow you got to get a wire from all the way over here to here, and this is not, basically it's too far of a gap to actually go directly from one entity to another, so you got to bridge the gap with these medium electric poles. So what we saw was, when you have one of these medium electric poles but you don't connect it to your central power grid, that actually causes it to be its own individual electric network, and that's actually really bad for UPS. One of the things you want to do, and this just wasn't as obvious until the benchmarks actually showed up, what you want to do here is you want to make sure that you always have a connection still to the actual electric network, so that every single power pole isn't its own unique electric network. Because what the game effectively does is it's going to, in a multi-threading concept, so that means it's going to use multiple threads to compute your electric network. If you have the main concept that you want to have is you want to have one electric network for your entire surface. So one for Novice, one for Vulcanus, one for each space platform, and that's already a guarantee. You're always going to have that, etc. The moment you have a whole bunch of power poles, then there's an individual network for each of these, and the game actually has to process, okay, is this thing drawing power from this? Yes, no. Is there a power source? No. Okay, and then keep on moving on. So because these don't actually have a electric network connecting to them, they don't have a source of power. And right now you're seeing here, because of the game, the way that I've set up all my test files, that have a global electric network. So that actually didn't even matter to the game, which was actually, I thought, really interesting in benchmarking. Keeping the global electric network set, even though, yes, this has power like everything else, this still added a whole bunch of overhead to the game and actually elevated the electric network pretty significantly. So basically what I'm just trying to say, if you're going to have a power pole to bridge any of your wires, your connection wires, just make sure that they also are all connected back to the same single electric network that you have for your entire surface. So you're not going to notice a difference if you have like 3 electric networks or 4 electric networks on Novice, but in this case, because of the way that I was copying this has 26 normal quality electric poles. So that means, and the way that I copied it meant that there was over 4,000 electric networks. And that actually had a significant, like basically 0.7 millisecond overhead on the entire map. So definitely minimize that, have the least number of electric networks that you can on a surface, and that'll improve it. So I made those corrections to this particular build, but it still is this way because these are all the original blueprints that were submitted. So another common problem that was happening was the way that the lead follower setup was actually working for the builds. So you'll notice here in this particular one, and this happened actually on quite a number of them, you see these little flickers that are happening. So this is like, this design was having that problem, this one as well. Let me turn off the other stats so that it's easier to read this. That flickering, that momentary pulse, was happening due to kind of being a little bit too tight with the lead follower insertion mechanism. So I've talked about this in the past. If you look at the Automation Science Pack here, this is dependent on how many beacons around the assembly machine, but in this particular case, there's the concept of an automated insertion limit. So the inserter can take something from a machine like this, and it can say, all right, I'm going to insert from this machine into this machine whenever this is less than 15. So if it's 4, 3, 0, 14, it'll put something in there. So, or 15 itself, and it will go and do that. Now, it counts 2 things. One, it counts the input that's here, but it also counts what is crafting. We've seen that in practice as we were testing this. So one of the things that was happening here is most people wound up saying, okay, well, really simple. I'm going to read this 15. Cool. I'm going to set the condition to be less than 16. So whenever it hits 15, I'm going to go and throw something into the machine. But you would notice that it would still get blocked. And it would get blocked because effectively whenever this machine would try to insert something into it, it would have to wait for a few ticks until it actually would drain down. Now, there's 2 ways to get around that problem. One way to get around it was just simply saying include in crafting. That would include the current item that is crafting currently that particular science. So by doing that, that would completely avoid all the little wake lists that are happening, and you're kind of seeing that here. This is now completely, or almost completely fixed. There's like a tiny little thing that's happening, occasional little blip, where it's like checking wake lists. That already gets you around it. The way easier one, though, is to just set this arbitrarily lower. So let's just say we set this to 8, and we set this one to 8 as well. The moment you do that, you'll see the wake lists are completely gone, because effectively all these are going to eventually be synchronized. And they're all going to be eventually synchronized because the stack inserters are always going to pick up 16. They're never going to pick up 12, 14, etc. So this actually works out pretty good because they will all eventually get synchronized to have the same amount in them. So you're seeing here, this is completely dropping almost completely down to 0, and exactly when it needs to, the other inserter can pick into it. So that's the benefit of lead follower. So really just a suggestion for, and I've seen this commonly in a lot of the designs here, and we just realized and talked about it as a group, is like, just set this lower. Just set this to like 4, 6, etc. And then you never have to worry about those kind of flickers right around being a little bit too close to being limited and not allowing it to insert and having to wait a couple ticks before it can insert again. It actually had a pretty massive performance difference, and I'll show that in the benchmark results here in a second. So, otherwise, one other concept that I wanted to talk about that I thought was a really cool and a different strategy to the lead follower approach is this one here. So what it's doing is, instead of, and this is actually taking a little bit of a concept that came from the lab design that I was working on, but it's iterated and it's a very unique approach, which is saying instead of monitoring the inputs of the particular machine, we'll use that for when we should actually insert these two different inserters should put something in. But in the rest of them, what this does is it reads the hand contents and it holds what is currently in it. And then it sends a pulse to all the rest of the inserters that are doing the same thing, so that are pulling gears out of it. So whenever it just happens to be greater, and what this does is it just sends a signal of -20, so just whenever it happens to be above 0, that's the case where both of these inserters are picking something up, it's going to effectively then send a signal to all the rest of the inserters to go and get activated as well. And it travels across all these wires. So there's a red and a green wire for each of the individual copper and for the gears that are going in. So I thought this was a really cool concept. So it was just a different take. Instead of monitoring the input of the assembly machine, just monitoring when they're actually actively swinging and telling the rest of the inserters to go do that. I don't think there's an effective big difference between doing it by, I guess the real big difference is you're eliminating at least 2 combinators in this setup, or really 3 combinators. So it's not a huge difference, but saving those extra 3 combinators, that was the question, is like, is that better? Or is it as equally as performant as some of the other builds? So I thought that was a pretty cool take. So this is also a really unique take on this concept here, where this design used a couple different things that were unique, but the one that I really wanted to touch on that I thought was interesting is that it's using effectively a clock here that is wrapping around every 47 ticks, and this is actually using inserter staggering, so something that came about in like some of my recent lab videos that I've talked about a lot, which was, what it does here is really cool. It's just every 47 ticks, it's going to wrap around a number, and it divides it here by 8. And so every 8 ticks, this number increases. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up until basically, it gets up until 5 like that. And so actually, if you slow down time here, you're going to see that each of these correspond to a number. So this is 2, 3, 4, etc., 5, and all the way to 6. And so this would just basically cascade all the way to the top like this. And you can see this kind of with a little bit of these yellow pulses as they go up the system here. So it's not exactly perfectly timed, and that's just an issue of how often it needs to insert it into there. So you do suffer from some of the wake lists here, but it is a really cool concept of using that inserter staggering, and it was the only one that actually did this. So this design actually had the lowest maximum update time, strictly because of this offsetting, which I thought was just really cool to see that it just utilizing spreading out how often these inserters are swinging, wound up just meaning that it had the lowest max update time. Now, the max update time doesn't matter as much as a stat in terms of like your actual performance of your base, but doing this in practice will increase a little bit your median UPS. So it might not do as well in a benchmark, but your actual gameplay performance by staggering things like this at a large scale, so at 40, 50,000 inserters, can make a pretty big difference for the spikes that you'll have in UPS drops. It probably is not, and I just want to touch on it here. It works really well in the lab setup because, like in my lab setup, I have 6,000 inserters I'm controlling, so having them all inserted at the same time is going to cause a huge spike in usage time. So it might not matter as much for an assembly building like this, but I thought it was so cool that they took the concept here of actually using a clock and setting in and staggering everything in that way. So just shout out to Zephyr24 for doing that. I thought this was a really unique take on this. I want to demonstrate next just kind of how I set up these benchmarks. So this is the simplest case. This is the baseline. What I wound up doing is, since we have designs that are going to be creating 240 per second, we have some that are making 480 per second, we have some that make 720, and some that make a total of 960. So those different flavors, basically the way that I just did that is I said, well, that's up to 4 lanes, 3, 2, or 1. Take the least common multiple of those, and that happens to be 12. So I just said, cool, to make them all the same, we're gonna have 12 lanes of continuous science, and that is gonna be a module. That is gonna be the baseline. So all of them have to conform to that. So if they happen to have a fluid bus like this, cool, then I just use this build. It's something that I pretty normally use. If I'm in an actual base, the way that I would wind up doing this is using a RS latch to turn them on and off and monitor an actual storage tank like this. I didn't include that for this particular test just because it didn't matter, because they're all going to have effectively the exact same miners. So just be extra noise in the background that wouldn't basically be baseline noise and should just stay the same. Using direct insertion, that makes the most sense. All the designs also have the max research for everything, so the maximum on like just really high stats, just something that would be actually in like a full like mega base end game kind of setup like this. So did that, created power network for everything, and then effectively just made sure that okay, all the electric power poles are all connected for some of the problems that we talked about in the past. All that's done. And then I just really simply, I used a mod which is made by Mulark, which is just an awesome mod, which is Region Cloner. Highly recommend it. What I basically just did was I made sure that, and you can pause the game like this and just have all the entities have the exact same amount of items in them. And then the simplest way to do this, you can use hotkeys, which is what I wound up doing, just to clone it to the north 7 times and then to the east 3 times. But if you want to do this from the GUI, just so you can see it, you can highlight all the items that are in here, and it actually just shows a really nice little UI of what you've highlighted. You can shrink that selection, and then you can go, in this case, I knew that I needed 384 lanes, so I just said, okay, I'm going to copy this 7 times to the north. And then what you can do here is you could highlight this whole thing. A way easier way, though, to do this is you can go into the console, and you can say auto clone, and then you can say the number you want and then the direction you want. So in my case, I'd want to go to the east, copy that. Cool. Way to get a little bit for all those entities to be cloned. Then you can see now from the map overview that we have a lot of builds that have been created. So that was effectively how I've done this. And then what I just wound up doing is I just started the game, ran it at 64x speed like this, and we'll take Region Cloner out of the map. Then we go into the editor, and then effectively I just would move my character somewhere. I don't really care where it's at, because it's not going to be actually rendered when you're running the benchmark, because it's no UI, so it's all just headless. Technically, something that we could be doing, just as a tiny micro optimization, is you could remove the mech armor, just so that you don't have a robot network on you. The tiny change, but it's something you could do. Anyway, so then set that up. Looked at, press F5 here, looked at the update time was over 2 milliseconds, which it is here. That's just what I wanted to have enough load on the system. I have a pretty powerful computer, so just want to make sure that I have a high enough update time so that I actually am stressing my CPU. So did that, and then watched the output here. I just ran it for about 10 minutes total for every single build, just to make sure that we were fully stable and running everything at maximum rate. And mainly the stat that I was looking at is over 10 minutes of time that we hit 5 million. Is a very specific number that I'll talk about in the benchmark at the end, but effectively 5.5 million was what I was looking for, 5.52 and change. So as long as it continued to maintain that across the build, I would say, okay, if it can survive for about 10 minutes sustained like this, and it's happy, then I will just go ahead and I will then just save this as one of the files, and I'll move on to the next one, and went on and so on and so forth. So, that being said, take your bets. What do you think is going to be the best design here? What do you think is going to work the best? Do you think belt-driven designs are going to be the best? Do you think that direct insertion is going to win? Do you think recipe switching is going to be the new meta that we're going to have? Do you think that casting items from into LDS and then directly inserting them and getting way above the automated insertion limit, I think that's the best method of doing this? Or do you think that the classic furnace setup is going to be the best? I'll let you make the judge which one of these designs are going to be the best, and then we'll get right into the actual benchmark results. So, without further ado, join me here in a second as we talk about the benchmark results. Let's get into the actual results. So we've talked about all the designers, all the design indexes. So again, just a refresher, 0 through 16, those are just the designs. And here's the lookup sheet. This is all in my GitHub repo. You can go and check all that out. There's a couple of notes here on some of the corrections that I've talked about with, fixing the isolated power poles and then correcting some of the one-off lead follow errors that we had. We'll go into more in depth on that later, but that's the point is here. Just if there was a correction that was issued for any of these individual designs, I just wound up going and creating a new version and I gave it a new save file. So if you see it here, here's the original one. Here's the one that I wound up creating, and that's going to be here in the preliminary results. So the preliminary, just before we get too far into it, let me just talk about the testing setup. We talked before when I was going over the benchmarking and the best benchmark setup itself, and we talked about using Region Cloner. The least common multiple was used to make 1, 2, 3, or 4 fully stacked lanes, and then each save file produced 5,529,600 red science per minute, so that was 384 lanes. Seems like a very oddly specific number, but 384 times 240 gives you this number, and as long as the build could do that for 10 minutes, we were good. So, the results. So this was the very first run that we did. We ran it for 36,000 ticks and ran it for 3 runs for each save file. So you're seeing here, these are all these abstract numbers, right? So I'll talk about which designs those are in the end in a second here, but effectively, here's all these different designs that we have, and this is actually in the order of the worst performer to the best performer. And you're seeing actually a really interesting distribution here if I zoom out a little bit. Here's our baseline. We only unfortunately had 2 designs that performed actually below the baseline, and that was a design that used LDS casting, and also the one that used the electric furnaces. But what's interesting is that if you're looking at these two, and let's go back to Factorio, if you look at the 2 designs that performed worse, and actually, so spoiler, the order that all these designs are in is actually the order in which they performed in. So now that spoiler's out, you can see that. So the worst performer was actually the furnace one, and that's not a surprise, because just the rate that these can produce copper compared to a foundry is just so much slower, so it just made sense that this is going to be worse. But what surprised me, and I did not intuitively think this, is that the performance difference between them, this is this design number 14 here, was not that much worse than the baseline version. This was, sure, we're talking this is an obvious drop off, but it's not that much worse. And it kind of goes to show just how correctly clocking things with the circuit network can make up a lot for just having better machines. So it goes to kind of showcase that. The other design that didn't do so well, unfortunately, was the LDS casting one. And the reason for that was we noticed, especially when running this, it was wildly expensive to use all these recyclers in such a short burst and make copper all at once. It was a large overhead on the actual network or on the entity update time. And so we saw huge spikes whenever copper was being created. So that was the main downside, and that was really what took a toll on this particular design, was just whenever LDS is getting cast and then is getting recycled, that was causing just a huge major spike in entities. So this kind of is going to show that one of the most UPS expensive items that exist in the game today are recyclers. So, spoiler, that's going to be a big drawback for any quality science, right? Is whenever you have a recycler like this that's doing something, it's going to cause a pretty massive amount of update time that it's going to take. So again, take it with a grain of salt, as all benchmarks go. This is in a, a perfect sandbox world. This is not representative of an actual game like I've talked about in the past, but it is something just to take note of. All the rest of the designs from here on wound up performing above the baseline, but I have a couple notes on this. So first, if you notice here, there's a couple things that are kind of going on. Most of the builds, as you trend upwards, are going to go from belt driven to direct insertion. In fact, all the builds effectively, and we'll show this here, all were direct insertion except for 5 and 6. And both 5 and 6 were direct insertion builds, but they just barely performed above the baseline. So that was counterintuitive. And when you looked at it, this just here's the raw UPS number is kind of deceiving. So what we wound up finding out, those were the two builds that suffered from the issue with the electric network problem. So specifically, those are these two builds here that actually, if you see here in the order, they're actually way higher than them being right next to the baseline over here. And that's just the moment that, and it's not in this, it's not showing it here because I don't have them connected because this is still the original blueprint, but in the actual save files, I connected all of these electric power poles afterwards and made that correction. This brought it down from about effectively 500 microseconds from electric update time to 100 microseconds, so it's a huge difference. We'll dive into that a little bit more. But once I made that correction, then these were more in line with the rest of the direct insertion builds, and then that made sense. So just, again, just to kind of cover it, you can kind of see it here, is that as you trend to the right, you're seeing belt-driven designs are more to, or like just are starting to perform better than this. We do have a double direct insertion build. This had a couple other problems that I mentioned earlier, but so that may have kind of thrown off where its placement should have been. But maybe if those circuit conditions were done and these were deleted, then that would have actually scored a little bit higher. But then we get another belt-driven build. Then we have the recipe switching one, which is direct insertion, but again, just experimental tech trying this out. So it did perform well, just not quite as well as some of the other ones. So we get another direct insertion build here, but then this one just didn't perform as well just to how long these inserters are constantly active for and are constantly still dropping items, and that it had effectively just the number of beacons that were actually around some of these foundries, unfortunately. So it just wound up being a little bit slower and just had a lot more entities than the next one. So this one just happened to win out compared to it. And this was still belt driven, and it's still using the lead follower concept here and just had less buildings overall. So it was just interesting that this one wound up winning over the other one. So this was a break from that pattern. And then from here on, you're just seeing like from design, this is number 5 all the way up onward. All the rest of these designs were all direct insertion builds. We'll talk about these in a little bit. So I'm going to talk through here now a few observations that I noted just from the actual benchmarks that we did and some of the lessons that we learned. So we talked before about the off by one lead follower control. So that was just, again, not inserting or inserting too close in the decider combinators to the actual automated insertion limit, or exactly setting it. And again, the fix was either setting this to include in crafting or just setting it to a much lower number. So what I wound up doing is I took design number 13. Design number 13, as just as for context here, go to back to Factorio, was this design. So this is a design that was created by Geist. I actually thought this was going to be the winner in the end, just because of purely just the number of furnaces that are here. It's only 12. It actually had the least to make 480 per second. So I just thought that was going to be automatically just the winner just because it just has the least number of entities. It was again, just suffering from the decider combinator being way too close to that number. So I use that as an example just to see if it would get better. And ultimately it did. So if you look at this was originally just taking design number 13 that had it a little bit too close to the automated insertion limit and then bringing it and getting it a little bit lower, just 10 or 8 in this case. So lowering it actually improved our entity update time because they just weren't for a pulse, a few pulses and just a few ticks, just not having wake lists and defaulting back to that and just purely relying on the control behavior to turn on and off. That actually made a noticeable difference. So we went from 1071 microseconds down to 1023. Now you might look at this and say, okay, that's not a lot, but it matters, right? So it's like if you do it, again, doing things with circuits is always going to make a small improvement. It's not going to make a huge improvement for micro adjustments like I'm talking about here. But it's enough to actually showcase that, okay, in a benchmark and probably in your actual real base, that kind of stuff matters. So it's just something to be aware of. So here's the proof that it made a difference. So now, this otherwise, the second part was these power poles not being connected. So again, for a point of reference, back here in Factorio, this was this design that you're seeing here. This was actually the worst design initially, not the worst, but just barely above the benchmark or the baseline when it was originally created, because it had just such an incredibly high electric network update time. So that's when you press F5 here and you look at the stats. This electric network update time was 0.7 milliseconds in those saves. And I was like, why is that happening? So as we dug in, it was just because these power poles weren't connected. And when you look at then back over here at the documentation that I've written, you can see that what was happening was there was 4,992 medium power poles that were isolated. And thus there was 4,993 electric networks in those save files. And you see that here by the disproportionate huge amount of electric heat fluid circuit update time. And really in the game, just to explain this a little bit, this number, always in general, this is the combination of the electric network, heat network, and fluid flow. This is all multi-threaded. So in essence, this number is always just going to be the max of these three numbers. So you're seeing here, this is 0.5. This is basically, this number is just the sum of these two in this particular case. But in practice, it's always just going to be what you want to optimize is the one that has the highest number. So in this case, it's multi-threading. It's going to run all across all of those. So in this case, for example, I have a 7800X3D, which has 16 individual threads that can be used at any particular time. So that means 16 different parallel things that can happen. So you're going to have enough like surfaces that exist. So space platforms, planets. It still is just best practice to always have one electric network on a surface, because you're typically going to already get to the number of threads that you're going to have just purely based on the surfaces that you have. So going for trying to optimize something, just if you're looking at a stat, this is always going to go up. Just the number of entities that you have, the more things that you have to power, there's not much you can do to get around it. But the best thing that you can do is just make sure all the electric networks are all connected. And that made a huge difference if you look back over at the actual stats, right? That dropped this huge electric network update. This was the highest by far across all the different builds, from 529 microseconds or 0.5 milliseconds down to about 123 or 104 nominally. And so you're seeing that huge disparity makes a difference in the end, not just in a benchmark. This is in a real game. This would have a huge impact. So removing any dangling electric power poles that you have around or things that are disconnected, that's a huge UPS optimization you can make. And the proof is here. You can 100% see it in this actual this update. So these have been fixed, and for all the relevant files I'm going to show in a second, all of these have been already updated and nominalized to all have the fixes included, because that's the true design. Just needed just a quick fix like that. It's an easy one just to include. So benchmarking best practices, I alluded to this, but I want to kind of dive deep into this. This is something that I personally learned on how to create benchmarks more effectively. What you really want to do when you're creating a benchmark, and I learned this by this was a little bit more difficult to set up, and this is coming from the design that had a multi-stage build. So that was this one here. When I had copied it originally, and when I had created it in the base, this is a really cool design. What it effectively does is it says, hey, you know, stage 1, you copy it like this, and then it's going to go and prime everything. And then what I wound up doing, and the mistake that I made, is that I went all the way until the end, and I've already demoed this, so I'm just going to quickly rush through this. I set it up like this. I then copied effectively this design in that same approach. So I did stage 1, and then copied that 12 times. And then stage 2, I copied over it. And then stage 3, I copied over it 12 times. And then I just used region cloner. And then I had an issue because everything got desynced, because it region cloner, and it's a game limitation. It can't do anything about it. This is a wonderful mod that's made by Moulart, so I highly recommend it. I think it's awesome. But what it can't do is it can't send in-flight signals. So things that are currently on the circuit network or that rely just currently on, I don't know exactly the concept, but the main problem is the in-flight circuit values that are being sent. It can't copy because it's a game limitation, and so things would get desynced, and so it wouldn't work. So just the first time that I went through it, I just said, okay, fine, I'll just copy stage 1, stage 2, and then just without thinking about it, I'll just force the final stage just on them one at a time manually. Well, that didn't work out at all, and that created a whole bunch of noise. And so you can see that here when you look at the difference between the testing methodology of when I went originally and copied it versus just kind of not caring and just placing them willy-nilly. It wound up basically updating the entity update time because they're just running at different points in times compared to the benchmark. And so now, does that mean that you need to make sure you start everything exactly at the same time in your actual game? Probably not. But for benchmarking purposes, it matters because it's not really reflecting what the game is doing in that tick for that specific design. So you want to copy it enough to have enough load on the system so you can get an understanding of like how much computing it has to do for that particular design and those entities. But you don't want them desynced, and because that creates a lot more noise in the background, and it's not going to be reflective of this design is perfect. This is like just amplifying the design itself. But it's like what you really kind of want is you want the game to say, okay, at the same tick, all of these inserters are going to be active at the same time. They're all going to swing across all the clones and all the copies that you have. So it's a little bit more reflective of what the game is actually going to do for your specific design. And then just making it high enough so that you have a good signal to noise ratio, right? If you just copy just one, then your computer background noise, other processes that are running would take away from that. So the lesson learned that I had there was when you're setting up a benchmark, pause the time, copy all your entities in, get into the configuration you want, clone it, and then start the game. That makes it easier so that everything is starting at the exact same point in time. So, and that made enough of a difference here in the save file for the benchmarks when they were run to lower the entity update time. I had done that for all the other save files pretty much, except for the ones where, again, I had some issues with the, like, just kind of copying them because they were a little bit more complicated to set up. So that was just to make it so it's more aligned. I did this one thing just to make it work a little bit better. So those are some of the lessons learned. Let's get to the final results now, the part that everyone's waiting for. All right, so let's go through the final results here. So here's all the original submissions. For clarity, what I've done is I have included them just in their original design number, and unless I made a blueprint change like the combinator change for Red Design 13, that's the only one that has a different name to it. So to kind of go through these, what I'm going to first want to talk about is the entity update time. So you're seeing and just how to read this graph. This is something that I have generated a quick script so I could use this for future videos. It takes the output of the verbose metrics that the belt benchmarking tool uses and then just generates a graph from it so that I can plot it and more easily explain it to people. So this was inspired by someone else on my Discord channel that winds up creating charts like this, and I thought it was great, so I just wound up copying their idea and creating my own script for it. So if you want to see it, that's also on my GitHub if you want to look at it. So the baseline has obviously the highest entity update time at 1765 microseconds or 1.7 milliseconds. So that was the highest consumer, and what you're seeing is immediately just from the very first one that performed above the benchmark, all those that performed below the benchmark are omitted for this particular end graph. You're seeing that immediately, just like this isn't even a direct insertion build. This is the exact, almost very identical to the original like baseline that I created, but is using inserter like lead follower circuit logic. So you can see here the jump immediately in the control behavior updates because we're using more circuits now. But the trade-off is just worth it. So we double effectively the control update time, but we gain a lot more from the entity update time getting dropped. And the more and more performant builds are the ones that did that the best. So really, if you look at two just like specifically designed 6 and 5, so the ones where the electrical wires were all reconnected, they jumped from being down in the bottom performers in the preliminary results, and then they jumped to being one of the highest performers just because of already direct insertion helped, but also having like the circuit control logic. So they're really good builds. And so what's interesting then from my perspective is just how much that wound up impacting them. So it's the thing that you have to look at and keep in mind when you're designing these. So with that, what's interesting is as you look at these direct insertion builds, The main differences that kind of come into play is just really beacon configurations and also the speed choices and how many assemblers versus like foundries that were there. And honestly, when I was looking at this, like I said before, Design 13 was the one that I thought was going to win, the one that was by Geist. Just purely because of the number of entities, the number of, they had less foundries than the other builds, I thought that it would win. It just wound up having a little bit less beacons, and it turned out that wound up impacting it more than compared to the other designs. So finally, what I wound up doing was, we were having a lot of debates about which of these were more optimal. I'm calling them exactly the same. I ran a whole bunch of extra benchmarks just to try to rule it out, and I think at this point there's like diminishing returns in how many benchmarks you're going to run. I ran one for 72,000 ticks for 3 runs, another one for 108,000 ticks in 10 runs. And they still performed the same way for me. What was interesting is talking to the End who created Design 16 on his laptop, which is running an Intel processor. It happened to perform better. Don't know exactly why. Just as interesting that on a different machine it wound up working better. So mileage may vary. I'm calling them equivalent. I have some other thoughts though on just kind of if I was going to use one design or the other, which one I would wind up using, and which I have in the conclusions, but I'll just demonstrate that for you since this is a video. So one of the things that I wound up saying was, okay, so why would I choose one design or the other? Mainly, the reason why I would wind up using Flap's design is, well, one, it performs ever so slightly better on my PC for whatever reason. But the main reason that I would probably stray away from this design is just mainly that it's not using all legendary modules. And I don't like going in, I don't have the means in my base, and I don't want to deal with the infrastructure of creating uncommon speed module 2s. So that's just a personal preference. I would rather just use all legendary for everything. So that is just so you can make that decision as well if you wind up using one or the other. All these are going to be in my blueprints. So if you want to use any of the designs that you've seen in this video, you can go to the actual, and I'll have this in the links in the video description as I have in all of them. These are all of my public blueprints, and you can check them out. These are all the uncommon builds that we have, and then now we have a place for the uncommon, or the common quality science builds as well, if you just want to go immediately and check those out. So that being said, this also leads into kind of a nice segue into an uncommon science that's 480 per second. So I took the original work by Civcal and Flap, and I wound up going and creating my own, which I'll just show here. There's a couple choices that I made that are a little bit different. I wound up just taking the inspirational work that they had created, and I just said, I'm gonna make a 480 per second version. The reason I chose this is just, it's a lot easier to tile with a fluid bus because you're gonna reach the 320 pipe length extent with Flap's design pretty quickly. And I just would personally rather have a lot more science on the same fluid network and create it all at the same time. And it also just makes it easier to tile. So it's just a choice that I made. This performs slightly worse than the 2 top performers, but it's in practice pretty easy to go and set up. So you can see all the pipes here are all connected between each of them. And the main design choice, both of these performed exactly equivalent in the different benchmarks that I ran, so it doesn't really matter which one you wind up using. But it just tiled really nicely, and you can just have them go across. You can do this exact same thing with Flap's design here. So you can also go and also I would recommend that you modify it this way. You can still have the pipes kind of go in between and then copy this build over and have those pipes connected. But just because it's a 240 per second build, in terms of what I'm going to need in my Megabase, I would just want to have a slightly longer version. So that's just what I would practically opt for. So if that's something that interests you, I've included that as a blueprint as well. This is design number 17. The way that you wind up just using it is you take the start, place it down, grab the expansion, place this down, and you can just keep tiling this as many times as you want to. And then all you got to do is just make sure that you get your fluid bus hooked up. Just come from somewhere, doesn't matter where, and just hook everything up here. And then it should all work. And you just have to connect it once on the inputs here, and then it goes horizontally across. And then that'll make, as many as you want basically here. This can tile up to a pretty decent extent before it maxes out. Let's see if we can get there. All right, there we go. And that is 374. So let's move this and remove this one. And we are, oh, ever so close. So I think you could probably delete these. And yeah, no, you won't get there. Okay, so we'll delete this one. And what would that make if you completely get it out to the full extent? That is going to be here a total of 24 lanes of signs that you can create on a single bus, which would be otherwise 12 on the original design. So it just barely fit the actual original template that I created. So I actually modified it for the actual save file to be this way, which inspired me to make this one. So now there's nothing also saying that you can't just tile up vertically and just move everything over. So lots of different ways you can do it. This is just an alternate design. So how did this one perform? Go back to the original stuff that we were talking about here. Go to the original README design document and scroll down to the bottom. So these are the alternate designs, so I included them just for point of reference. So here's 17 and 18 included. You can see that they're still up here, but they're just not the absolute best. And 17 and 18 flopped when I tested them again separately, so this is just a separate benchmark just to showcase that. But just in perspective here, really, again, compared to the original baseline, all these are doing way better, and these are just performing slightly worse in terms of their entity update time. Didn't quite investigate it, but we're talking about, you know, in practice, this is not going to make a huge difference in terms of the individual designs there. But like if you're running them in isolation. Point of preference, logistics choice, I just wanted to give some extra options if you're going to use some of these different designs. So to conclude the video, we end where we began with this Omega build here. Why am I including this? Mainly because I just want to remind people that your goals in the game might be very different. This design here on the left accomplishes the exact same goal with the design on the right. The main difference is that this design is really good for mega basing when you're trying to get the most bang for your buck in terms of update time. But this design is awesome for a 1000x build, for example, where you're going to be stuck with all these lower tech items for a very long time. So depending on what your playstyle is and what you're doing in the game, there's no reason that you should have to pick the design that we have ultimately landed on today. For the goals of this series, though, the point of why we're doing this is for mega basing. So if that's something that interests you, subscribe, come along for the ride as we continue to explore all the wonderful designs that everyone in my Discord group has created. And also, if you're interested in doing more, if you want to get involved in some of these competitions we'll have in the future, check out the Discord, come and hang out. I'm going to try to figure out how to automate this process because it frankly does take a lot of my own personal time to go and create it, but I enjoy the heck out of it. So just again, just want to say just a thank you to all the wonderful people that have submitted a design for this, and thank you for all the hard work. And just as a reminder, this is not a competition to find the best designer in the group. It is to find the best design. And I've also appreciated that every single one of the members in this list here that you're seeing, that they all have the same mentality. And that's what this whole game is about, is creating the best designs that we as a community can create. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Abuck Nasty, and have a wonderful rest of your day.